Good morning, everyone. Mr. LeBlanc here. Hope everybody's had a great weekend. First lesson back to start us off this week is Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner's Rebellion is huge. I think a lot of people don't give it the credit it deserves. Nat Turner was a slave. He eventually ran away at age 22, only to return back to the plantation. He returned back to the plantation because he received visions from God, basically saying that he is to help free the slaves. At this point in his slave career, he begins being a preacher. He was raised by his grandmother. His mother eventually dies. He's raised from his grandmother, who is obviously an abolitionist at soul and is a very religious person. So he grows up with this religious and abolitionist belief system, and it helps mold him. It helps mold him into the preacher that he is. His masters allow him to travel and become a preacher at different plantations around the Southampton area, which allows him to network, have secret meetings with other slaves. So when the rebellion takes place, this helps him already have the groundwork at other plantations. He and his fellow slaves begin the uprising by killing all whites on his current plantation, and then they begin traveling to every plantation within walking distance. They're working their way across the state, and ultimately, on their way to a town called Jerusalem, they are stopped. Nat Turner goes into hiding. He ends up living in the woods for about 2 months. I think it's about 64 days in the woods. He's eventually caught by a farmer, not a slave catcher, not a militiaman, not a part of the United States government who is looking for him. Just a random farmer catches him. And he's ultimately tried. He is hung. They disgrace his body in the afterlife, and they bury him they disgrace his body after he is dead, and they bury him in an unmarked grave. The South wanted to try to set the example that this would not be okay ever again. The problem is because of not that it's a problem, but what this did was, instead of having a positive impact where other slaves wanted to become part of this uprising and saw this, and it helped to wake up the North. All of those things are what Nat Turner envisioned happening. The actual outcome was more of a negative thing, and by that I mean it led the South to have much more strict slave laws and slave codes. What I mean by that is the South was afraid. They saw what had just happened. They saw how Nat Turner was able to rise a bunch of slaves up against the few whites that they had in the South. If you think about it, we're talking the population of the South is millions of slaves, not millions of whites. So this began to scare many Southern families, Southern plantation owners, and they began to treat their slaves harsher, attempted to intimidate them much more, limited their freedoms. Now no slaves were allowed to read. Religion was very questionable in the time period, and it led to much, much more of a strict slave life in the South. It did not necessarily help to wake the North, although it did fuel a little bit of abolitionist causes in the North. However, the key outcome of Nat Turner's Rebellion is actually it's helped to tighten the slave codes in the South, so it had a negative impact. Nat Turner is an American hero. He is the first and most successful of all the slave rebellions in the South, and I think that cannot go unmentioned. I think he's a huge part of the abolitionist movement, which is why I teach it with the abolitionists. It's not like your William Lloyd Garrison or your Frederick Douglass. He took more of a literal attempt at abolitionists, and he tried to fight evil with evil, which is not usually how we teach the abolitionist movement. So I think it's important to know abolitionist was happening on both sides of the scale. But unfortunately, in this case, again, the key takeaway is Nat Turner's Rebellion actually helped to strengthen the slave codes in the South and make slavery more structured and strict because the whites had seen this and began being very, very, very intimidated and afraid. Any questions, as normal, please put them in the comment box or reach out to me, Mr. LeBlanc. Hope everybody has a great week.